Thank you. It's a little intimidating. I thought I would talk about the turrets in a couple of areas. One of them is sort of where it came from, why architecture on Mount Desert Island is important, and then a little bit about the architect, and a little bit about the era, and a little bit about the building and the family that built it, and a little bit about the builders, and then a little bit about the history of what happened when College of the Atlantic took it over. This is this is from a copy from Vincent Scully's book called The American Stick and Shingle Style, and in this book he calls this building the first shingle masterpiece ever built in America. And I'm not going to say this right, but I think what he was trying to say was, up until this point, America and its architectural personification was, was plenty of Cape Cods and stuff like that, but when it came to larger buildings, they were copying European architects verbatim. The Queen Anne style, which this kind of grew out of, and I'll show you another one similar to it, was an English style of architecture that Americans were copying. But then the rusticators came along, the Civil War was over, industry was booming, and people came to the woods, I think, to get away from the miserable conditions their factories had created in the cities, but also to begin to look, they could afford to, and to begin to look for those sort of magical places in the country to live. When they came here, the architects and builders that sort of helped them inhabit this part of the world were really taken by the wood-built boat building sheds and workshops and homes built all along the coast of New England. They began to sketch it and bring it back to the cities where they worked, and the rusticators got kind of bold and said, let's try something different in our summer homes. This was built in 1879 by William Ralph Emerson, and it's on it's down on the end of Barbary Lane. It's still there. It's called Redwoods, and Mr. Erickson, who unfortunately just died recently, but he bought it in 1940 and was going to tear it down, and fell in love with the building, and it's really a wonderful, wonderful building. And it basically, this style of architecture started right here in this town and kind of grew across New England, and you can find buildings like this in other parts of the country as well. The architect we're going to talk about, who did the turrets, came up here in 1879, 78. He did the West Street Hotel, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this was down where Tom Walsh's hotel is now. And it looks like it was about the same size, if not even a little bigger. And he also built a building in the kind of Queen Anne style / shingle style called the Craigs, which was burned in the '47 fire, but was on the site of Amory and Betty Thorndike's home, which Betty Thorndike was one of the early trustees of College of the Atlantic, and quite a wonderful person. Bruce Price was the architect who built those, not the Emerson building, but a number of buildings here and around the country. He was born in Cumberland, Maryland in 1843. He didn't go to the sort of formal schools. He went to work as an apprentice in Baltimore, worked hard, and at 19 years old. This is putting him working as an apprentice in an architecture office during the Civil War, which is kind of interesting. And then he went on to on his own. He saved some money and he went to Paris, went to France, and he traveled around for about a year, came back, worked for another firm, fell in love, married a nice young woman from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. They moved out to Wilkes-Barre, where he practiced architecture briefly in the 70s, I think it is, 1870s, and they had some children, and one of them died. And I think they were devastated, and he moved to New York, and then his life seemed to change a lot. He seemed to just be a very driven person and a very hard-working person, and he moved to New York and had a partner, and then they parted ways amicably, and he started his own practice, ultimately building it up to some 50 people in New York City. And they did major public and academic structures around the country and in Canada. This architect did buildings, Osborne Hall at Yale, he did a building at Columbia, buildings at Hotchkiss. He designed railroad cars for the Canadian Railway, and having done those successfully, they asked him to design the Albert Hotel in Banff, the Chateau Frontenac up in Quebec. And the turrets was built the same year that the Chateau Frontenac was built by the Bruce Price's office. In 1883, he ran into, met Pierre Lorillard, and they looked at some property outside of New York City in Tuxedo Park, 7,000 acres of property outside of Tuxedo Park, and Bruce Price and some other people developed this land for Pierre Lorillard. This is an old postcard of the entrance. And what's interesting, and you'll see later on, is it was surrounded by this stone, and the scree, the rubble rocks that had fallen off the hill were sort of down at the base. And the first thing he did was reuse those rocks and build a gatehouse and what they call a keep. That's a more recent picture of the keep. And you can see the stonework. It's rustic. They love this wasn't, H.H. Richardson was a contemporary of Bruce Price's as well, and this big, rustic, tough architecture was something that was, I think, relatively new and kind of a celebration of the sort of rural romanticization and celebration of the rural life. You can see in this sort of big stones. I don't know if it was the tradespeople that were building it, but big kind of awkward stonework with the mortar set back in rather deeply, all pretty much the same size, some of them running vertically. In this work, he went on to build a lot of houses in Tuxedo Park. The one I showed you just previous to this, P. Lorillard's house, he did. This is an interesting house he did there in 1883 to, 85 to 86, for someone named either Candler or Chandler. But this is a house that Frank Lloyd Wright did 3 years later, and Frank Lloyd Wright was quoted as very much admiring Bruce Price. And if you look at these carefully, with the bay windows and the large triangular gable end and the sort of decorative but enthusiastic symmetry, you can see how he was an influential designer of his day. Another building he did, which you can see why this one is on the screen, that he did in Tuxedo was a place called Turtle Point. And here you can see the stonework getting just a little bit more refined. Still pretty rustic at the bottom, but then it gets a little bit more refined in the sort of arches and columns or some other buildings he did with this sort of interesting granite columns, which look a bit like the turrets. Price then went on. That was about late 80s. This is 1895, and it's the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec. Some questions about the roof of the turrets. This is what the Chateau Frontenac's doing to fix their roof. How in the heck did they get up there to do that? It's a wonderful building, and anyone that's been there will know. There was this kind of ponderous, dark, heavy, boy, those guys at that point built big, strong, sturdy buildings. They celebrated the masonry work and the substance of construction whenever they had a chance. Now, same year, there's the turrets. Sorry about the slide, but that's as good as we can get it. There's the turrets, 1895, same year. There's the carriage house that was there. They had, I believe it's cypress roofs. One of the things I read said the shingles were 22-inch long cypress shingles. And this building, if you look into it, seems to, one article said that, report said that the builder designed this building. But he certainly was doing a good job of trying to match the turrets. This is about 50 by 100 feet. This is something like 60 by 90 feet. So this was a big carriage house. Things interesting about Tuxedo Park was a little earlier than this. They had these mansions. These folks built these big, vacation houses, but they didn't want their stable. It's not like the garage was next door, so you could get to, right up against the house, because it was a stable, and it had manure. So the carriage houses were always away from the main houses, someplace downwind, and these, I think, I'm guessing along the Route 3 in Bar Harbor, there probably were a number of carriage houses along the road. In Tuxedo Park, one of the most charming parts of that place now is the carriage house. It's a little village of carriage houses all together, and it's just a beautiful part of a piece of architecture. This burned down in the 1947 fire. There's Guy's, was it Guy's Cliff, the name of the original Kelber Hall? And I don't know who did this one. Daniel Burnham. It was where the gardens are between Riles and the turrets now. There was a house right there, and there are articles written about this little thin piece of land that Mr. Emery and Mr. Price built a house on. And the 8 oaks that were on the land, and the draining the swamp that was on the land, or wetland that was there. And I would imagine that draining must have occurred where that stream was down there, but I'm not totally sure. This is the building probably soon after it was built. You can see the woods that were down closer to Riles. And you can see the driveway was different configuration. There was very minimal planning. In fact, one of the 1895 articles about the turrets, there was a kind of a comment from the person that wrote the article that it was kind of skimpy landscaping. And then later on, a few years later, there was this big article by the landscape architect who had brought the turrets up to par. But there were exposed ledges on the way down to it. I don't know that they had built the little tea house nap building that was set down on the water's edge. You can see here that the servants' wing was just 2 stories high. Shutters, really see any, and the trim is dark. There was some article about Bruce Price's work that suggested that he liked to take the sort of rustic stonework and used kind of colors that blended into the natural environment. Here's a nice, I'm sorry the pixels are small, but this is a picture of the water side before the building was renovated, right after it was built. And you can see that retaining wall where there was a fountain built is not there yet. They talk about the basement being a laundry, and they were going to put a bowling alley down there. And you can see this was just a wall. This is again just 2 stories high, and there's no building up here. It was. They talk about Mrs. Emery's bedroom. She walked out. This was her bedroom, and I believe this was Mr. Emery's bedroom. And they had bathrooms in dressing rooms each, and supposedly it was very beautiful to walk out onto that balcony. I was trying to get a handle on this. When this happened, what was going on? Bruce Price was born in 1843, built the turrets in 1895. He died in 1903 on his way to build a palace for the Prince of Japan. Edgar Allan Poe and Hawthorne and Dickens, Thoreau's writings were kind of around at this point, probably well read. Melville, nobody was reading him, but it was 18 at that time, but he died in 1891. John Ruskin was alive and writing. Emily Dickinson was writing her poems at this time. I was just trying to get a handle on what's going on. Why are these people doing this? What formed the vision for these kind of buildings? Degas was painting. He was painting during this time. Mark Twain was almost a contemporary of Bruce Price. Winslow Homer was painting at this time. H.H. Richardson was the great, wonderful architect of the day as well, and Henry James was writing. He was almost an exact contemporary of Bruce Price, Henry James. Claude Monet, John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, the sort of what I call the robber barons, but they were changing the American economy and creating these magnificent places all around the country, where possible. Mary Cassatt was contemporary of Bruce Price's. Thomas Edison. 1879, when we saw the picture of the shingle-style building of the Emersons, and sort of around the time of the beginning of Tuxedo Park development, that was when Thomas Edison invented the light bulb and there was electricity. And when we started working on the turrets, the electric wires were inside of brass conduit, because the brass conduit they were used to running brass conduit to run gas, to the gas lights. So these wires, correct me again, Millard or Sass, but there was like tar paper around the wires, which were inside of brass pipes, which ran all through the building. Thomas Edison, Nicholas Tesla came a little bit later. Louis Sullivan came a little bit later, and then Frank Lloyd Wright came quite a bit later. The music that was the composers were Brahms and Tchaikovsky, Dvorak and Grieg. This was the environment that this was going on in, I think, and kind of interesting to get your mind in that place. J.J. Emery was a man who had inherited the beginning of a fortune from a company in Cincinnati, Ohio. They made candles and soap. And he also became quite an enthusiastic real estate developer, and had made a very large fortune by that time. And it's kind of a compliment that he would hire someone like Bruce Price to do a building, because he probably knew a lot about construction and buildings throughout the country in New England. The building was built with 1,700 perch of stone. And the stone was quarried from the Eagle Lake Quarry, from a Weber Quarry Company. And a perch it varies. In fact, when they wrote construction contracts about these buildings, you had to define in the contract what perch meant. And because you're talking about quantities of stone, so if it's shale, it's one kind of stone. If it's granite, it's another kind of thing. So what a perch was on the safe side was a ton of stone, or 16 cubic yards of stone. And it varied from 16 to 20 cubic yards, depending on the type of stone, and it varied from a ton to a ton and a quarter. So if there were 1,700 perch of stone put into this building, that's 3,400,000 pounds of stone were brought from Eagle Lake down to the edge of Frenchman's Bay and built by these guys. This was run by a man named John Clark, who was from Bar Harbor and had been building buildings, and kind of like Palladio in Vicenza. And he was in the right place at the right time. The rusticator showed up, and Mr. Clark was a wonderful builder. And so he ran this project, and there were at least 100 people employed on it for 2 solid years. This started in 1893 after Mr. Emery met his wife, whose name was, oh my God, her name was Leila Alexander. And I want to find this so I get it right. It was Leila Alexander. She was the daughter of a Civil War Southern general from Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. And Mr. Emery married Miss Alexander in 1892. And one of the gifts he gave her for their wedding was this house. And they had some children. And he lived from 1895 to 1908. They spent their summers in this building. But they hired Mr. Clark, and Mr. Clark got local masons named Norris to do the stonework, to do that 3 million pounds of stone. And they ordered some beautiful carved work from Venice, and they had a cabinet maker from Boston named Page from Charlestown, Massachusetts, Boston area, do the interior cabinet work. And then they had a local man named Candage do was the foreman for all of the trim and stuff. The outside is all this cut granite. And the point is, when we go back, and that's what's so cool about this, you can go back, that you see how the stone is much more refined, kind of like the shingles. It's starting to be a smooth surface, and it kind of sheds water a little easier, grows moss a little more difficult. It's a little more difficult. The ice doesn't quite bother it. We'll talk in a minute about some of the things that the ice does do. And you can see the cypress or cedar shingle roof. The plumbing was, the articles that were quoted in the Bar Harbor Record and in a Bangor paper were described the building as being like the strongest, most fireproof building ever made. And they keep talking about it, and it is in books called The 100 Wonderful Buildings of the Golden Era, and it's in various books citing it as a wonderful piece of construction. And the plumbing, the building is made with steel and concrete floors between the floors. Concrete is a question, I think pretty much it's sound deadening, but it's also, I'll tell you in a minute, that it's fireproofing, and it was meant to be fireproofing. The partitions between these walls are brick. The plumbing not only was nickel, and there was even a silver sink in the kitchen, but there's also a standpipe. They had a 2-inch standpipe run up the back stairway over here with fire hoses on it, and the 2-inch line ran straight out to the street. So even in 1895, they were concerned about fire on Mount Desert Island. There was one other firm called Layton and Davenport were the plumbers, and Green and Reynolds from Bar Harbor were the people that did all the copper work. And that meant they did the ductwork inside because it was a hot air heating system, as well as the fireplaces in each of the bedrooms and the main rooms. But also they did all the copper work around the eaves and flashing around the roof. Here's the picture of the Weber Quarry out on Eagle Lake. This is the Venetian walnut, and Barb Sassman did a wonderful senior project where she met with Joe Tracy, who came in and they discussed all the ways that this rather derelict building when College of the Atlantic inherited it, how to kind of carefully correct it and bring it back to life. After Mr. Emery died, about 10 years later, Mrs. Emery married a man named Captain Alfred Anson, and they went abroad, and one of their children, Mrs. McKay, who was the young woman in this picture. See that little girl right there? That's Mrs. McKay. She came and visited the building while we were working on it and told us that was her. She married a Colonel Anson, and they lived there in 1938-39. They extended the servants' wing to 3 stories from 2 stories, and remodeled the porch. 1940, they unfortunately gutted the right-hand side of the first floor when you walk in the door off to the right. That was supposed to have been absolutely wonderful, and walnut bookshelves and so forth. In those days, you went into a great hall, and it was kind of a meeting place, and I don't know, it was maybe the living room or something. It was the way they lived. I don't understand exactly the culture then. Maybe I should watch Downton Abbey. But they would go into this hallway, and there were 2 couches back to back, and there was a humongous plate glass window right straight ahead that looked out at Bar Island. And it was plate glass, because they could make plate glass that big in those days, and they were proud of it. The windows here, sorry about jumping around here, but these windows up here were what they call bottle glass. We did a lot of calling around when we got to work on this building, and we talked a lot with the man who was in charge of the Chateau Frontenac facilities, and we talked Rambush, a woman named, I think her name was Catha Rambush, and they were from New York City. They were New York City restoration people, and man, she knew everything. And she said, "Oh, send me some pictures. Oh, that was probably bottle glass." If you look carefully, it was that glass that had a round, it was lead muntins and that round discs. Anyway, unfortunately, styles changed, and the fire came through, and so they put a slate roof on the turrets after the shingle roof, and really sort of modernized the interior and did things like tore down beautiful walnut cabinets, and this is what it looked like in the first place.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty weird, huh? The Victorian style. I mean, there's people that here, I know, who know about all this sort of, these are Venetian pieces of furniture, but to a person that doesn't know about interiors and furnishings and stuff, it looks like you walk into the house, oh, they have one of these and one of those and one of these and one of those. Oh, and they've got one of those too. It's like everything is packed in this collection of trophies. And there were magnificent things in there. Renaissance furniture. Chinese porcelain sat on top of the quarter-sawn oak paneling. Delft wallpaper. I mean, that looks like a Gainsborough. It probably isn't. But there were some kind of elephants out front that came from India. And another thing too, for people that know the building, see straight up here, I'll use the pool cue. That they had these pendants that kind of came down at the intersection of all of the pieces that in the 50s got cut off for some reason. And this room got whitewashed. It was whitewashed. It had a big fireplace. The dining room had a big fireplace that had caryatids, which were, there's statues that kind of look like they're holding up the mantle, carved wood. And the marble in the fireplace in the dining room was red marble. And when we did some renovation work and took the mirror down, there was some really beautiful red marble there. In the fireplace that was in what they call the music room, which is you come in the front door and you walk into the first door on your right, that was the waiting room or sitting room or something like that. And then beyond it, on the water side, running the whole length of the south east corner, was what they call the music room. And that was pink marble. They had very deep, flowery fabrics. Fortuny was the fabric that Mrs. Thorndike found under some wallpaper, under some old wallpaper upstairs. And the fabric that hung in the doorways was the same pattern as on the walls. I wonder too, this is just, there's no reason for this, but I've thought about architecture a lot, and this is an oversimplification, but I thought, modern architecture kind of assumes that it's this frame and human beings are in their skin. Who you are is what's from your skin in. And the building is like a frame that you move through. And these older buildings seem to look like the attitude might be that human beings are like how far they can see, how far they can hear, how far they can reach. And so this is who you are. It's all this stuff all over the place. So it's not just an accumulation of treasures, but sort of people were showing who they were too. I don't know if that's true. The ironwork at the gates that unfortunately came down, we maintained the wall and the gates when I was here as best we could with the limited people that were available on the staff. But it just, the stone really, with the salt and the plows and the location, just came down, and it's kind of heartbreaking because that's absolutely beautiful ironwork. So Mrs. Anson died. She died in 1953. She lived in the house. Actually, they laid her in state on the second floor in her bedroom after she died. So she must have loved it here. And her son died in 1976. And I'm not sure what happened after 1953. I understand that the building got sold probably, and I read something that said it became a bed and breakfast. Maybe someone here knows. I'd really love to know. But the College of the Atlantic came into being in the early 70s and sort of inherited the turrets. The Oblate seminarians had it for a while, and they tried to fix it. They owned this property and the Guy's Cliff property, or whatever the property the college was. And unfortunately, they made a mistake. They pointed up all the weep holes, which is what you do in a stone building. You needed to sort of breathe. But they were doing the best they could, and it went into real decline. And there's an amazing article written in '71 by a man named Parr from the Bangor paper, saying, "How could you let this happen? This is one of the treasures of New England." And truthfully, really, motorcycle gangs were having parties in it. They, you know, in early July, this sort of gangs would come up and come through town, and this was a place they could crash. And when we first went through it, I mean, there were hoses and needles and broken mirrors and wax signs on the floor and stuff written on the walls. And boy, College of the Atlantic, when it first took it over, they did not have the kind of resources to fix this building, that were, the resources that were needed. But we didn't want to see it deteriorate. We didn't want to see it fall into disrepair. I include this because for some of the folks that are here, long ago, you know, when you don't have any money, particularly I found this over time as an architect, when institutions don't have money, they make plans. They make a lot of plans. Well, maybe we can do it. No, we better think about that, you know. But even then, even back in the early 70s, in one of the many plans, the turrets was always part of the heart of the campus. This is an interesting one because this plan assumed that the property would go north to where Davis property is and not go south. But it's interesting how times change and improve, actually. We didn't want to have the building get broken into anymore. We needed to hold it but we didn't have the resources to protect it or the funds to board it all up, and we didn't know if boarding it up would hurt it. So Dick Davis came up with a wonderful idea. There was a guy named David Winship who was a student here, and he really was Benjamin Franklin in the early days. He liked to print things with a printing press. And so Dick went to him and he said, I need you to print a sign. The sign needs to say, caution, this building is dangerous. It has been fumigated with lead arsenate and copper sulfate. They named all, they went to the chemistry teacher and named all this stuff. And then we went to the hardware store, bought cans of Raid, and totally saturated the signs so that they reeked of chemistry. And nailed them on the first floor windows and doors and never had a break-in. It's a great solution. This is more of what the building looked like. You see the trim was white. Kind of interesting. This is cleaned up actually from when we found it. This was the kitchen on the first floor. I don't have enough of these pictures. The one wonderful picture that Brad sent me was just too small. You know, I couldn't get it to project. But this is the kitchen. Big slabs of marble. You can see the brick knobbing and some of the work behind the wall structures. There was an elevator. I guess Mrs. Anson had gotten infirm, and so they put an elevator. This is, if you go up the stairs to the second floor, the long hall, there's stairs that go up to the third floor. And this was the elevator shaft that was there. So we decided, Barb Sassman, Jonathan Gormley, Harris Hyman, we decided we were going to try to fix it up. And it was all college meetings and building committee meetings, and we all worked together to do it. And we created this fake architecture firm named after Bruce Price and ourselves. And we made a report, and we went around trying to say, you know, hey, this is a project that really shouldn't go without our, you know, some attention. It's a real treasure. I remember going in one time trying to go into I don't know how to do this stuff. Some of you people here probably are very good at this, but I'm not an architect that understands the proper procedure for historic stuff. And there's a sort of a charming old-timey ritual about it. So I went to the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities in Boston. And I went and I said, you know, I just walked in and I said, you know, from College of the Atlantic. Oh, yeah, where's that? Oh, that's in Bar Harbor, blah, blah, blah. We have a building we're trying to save, and I thought if I could just, you know, talk to you, maybe you could give me some advice, tell me how to go about this. And the guy really blew me off. I mean, it was like, I don't talk to people that just don't know what they're doing. And I said, well, can I use your library? And he said, well, sure, go ahead. And I got this book that was about the 100 most wonderful buildings of the turn of the century, and there's the turrets. And I kind of brought it in and put it on his desk, and the guy goes, oh, okay, yeah, sure, I'll talk to you now. And then we did a lot of stuff. Earl Shuttlesworth, who's still the head of the Historic Preservation Office, Sass drew these amazing drawings of what we might do were there to be funds available. And you all, my memory's not as good as it should be, but we really went through a process with what funds we had. Dick Reinhardt was a man here who helped do government grants. I remember at one point Jonathan printed this beautiful kind of brochure. It's still kicking around. It ought to be reproduced, of the turrets with some history of it. And we just, by the seat of our pants, really put all this stuff together. We said, well, this could be an auditorium, and that could be a gallery, and the Great Hall, and this is going to be a conference room, and here's a dormitory. And here's going to be the common room for the dormitory, the kitchen, and we got nice John Roman from the architecture firm of Webster Baldwin, now it's called WBRC in Bangor, helped us. We got government grants, we got funds from the Historic Preservation, which kind of helped us pay John Roman to do the engineering study. Let me see. We also suggested then that, and this is, the people were in this room. There was not that many. It wasn't a big deal. It was a big deal to us, but it wasn't a lot of people on a big event. It was just people plugging along, wanting to make something happen. We suggested the second floor. This was Mrs. Anson's bedroom and her bathroom, and I don't know if that was her dressing room. This was Mr. Anson's bedroom, and his dressing room was in that turret, and then that was his bathroom. There's a story about that in a minute. And then there were some other bedrooms here. These got converted into offices and classrooms, we suggested in these plans that we drew. And then there were little dormitories, little bedrooms in the servants' wing. And we got some CETA grants, which in the 70s, late 70s, when the economy was bad, you could get some people. So that's Charlie Steinmetz, and this is Claude Baldock, and Hartley, I think her name was Tara Hartley, helped. They gave us a salary for these people to come help, and we started shoveling the building out and cleaning it up. One of the things that happens in an old building, and we'll go into something else that's even more important in a minute, but one of the things that happens is all of these, I think that's snow, all of these doors that are on masonry, horizontal masonry is horrible in ice and snow climate like this, and these doors leaked, and they leaked in and they rotted the entire floor out of the dining room. And so that's Fred White, and that's his brother. And this is what the dining room looked like. It was whitewashed. This is off to the left as you go into the turrets. And Fred, the structure, these French doors had rotted the ends of the floor beams out to the point that it was dangerous, and you'd walk and the floor would go down. So Fred and his brother took the floor apart. That's the required butt shot. But they took the parquet floor up carefully in order, and they stacked it in reverse order behind them. They tore all the rotten beams out, cut in chunks, and took them out. They replaced them with pressure-treated, structurally sound floor-carrying beams, put the subfloor, the parquet floor back down, and they had to replace 3 pieces of oak parquet when they were done. As we did this, there was all kinds of what we did, because we didn't have any money, and what you do with a big project like this, I think, in hindsight, I think this, and again, I would really defer to people that have more experience, but you can't do the whole thing as one big job. It just doesn't work that way. There's so many bits and pieces all over the place that you kind of divide the problem up and conquer it in little pieces and you prioritize them. That was because we couldn't afford it anyway, but we could also say, well, what's the worst thing? Well, a floor's rotting. Okay, let's fix that. The other thing we did was, instead of hiring one contractor to do it, we hired like 4 carpenters. And we have 4 different local carpenters. Fred White was one of them. Tubby Collier's company was another one. I can't remember them all. Some of the students did work. These are students, COA students that had worked. It looks like COA students today too, doesn't it? But they did work. This is, I know Paul Beltramini and Steve Aransky. This is Alexander Brown. I don't know who this in this one is.
That's Rob.
Rob?
Corbett.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, they each took different parts. We had 2 electricians work on the building. We had plumbers help us. And we would literally contract out to 2 masons, Glenn Weber and the Norwoods. And we would literally, Glenn, will you please do this part of the servants' wing? And okay, Norwoods, will you please do the broken lintel over the entry hall? What was kind of cool was they liked to work next to each other, so it wasn't competitive as much as they were sort of inspired by each other's presence. And, of course, these crazy students running around made it even better. So one of the big problems that the turrets had was there's this canyon, and stone doesn't do well, look at the shoreline, in crevices that, in canyons. The snow and ice get in there and they just quarry. You know, the shingle style house that's 1879 is in pretty good shape. It's all wood. The shingles act like the scales of fish. Stone, not so much. It gets cold. It starts to sweat on the inside where there's warm air condensing on the cold stone. That water comes down, then it freezes that night, and the frozen water falls into crevices and expands, and it starts to quarry things apart. Particularly in large areas where the snow drifted in and so forth. One of the things that the Webster Baldwin Roman firm, John Roman, taught us was these are big heavy timbers, and we had those CETA guys and some of Tubby Collier's men come down and use heavy timbers to stop the 2 buildings from falling into each other. What had happened was the snow and ice had rotted its way right down through this canyon. The servants' wing was really isolated from the main building. You could only come through one door, which was the butler's pantry into the kitchen and the back hall. So this was open to the weather, filling with snow and ice, and began to tear the building apart. And the chimneys with a masonry building, you have to judge how far out of plumb the masonry's going. And I believe a rule of thumb is you drop a plumb line down the center of the object, and if it moves outside of the middle third of whatever masonry object you're studying, then it's beginning to be in real trouble. And these chimneys that were running along the north side of the main part of the house were way out by 3 or 4 inches out of plumb. So the first thing we do is we got these timbers and we just stopped it from continuing to fall over. Then we gutted the area there, and because if this was going to be a dormitory, you can't have bedrooms that don't have more than one way out. If smoke fills up downstairs in the living room, you've got to be able to not run down the stairs into the fire-filled room. You've got to be another way out. So what we thought we'd do is not only close off the canyon, but create a second means of escape from the second floor of the servants' wing / future dormitory. And this arch, there was a window here we took out, and this arch, keep your eye on it, we moved it up and created a back door out of what was, as we did it. This used to be a store, like a pantry closet for the kitchen in the old building, and we created a back means of egress. There it is, done today. I don't know if the historic guys would love this. You know what I mean? I don't think today they would want you to do that, but I'm really glad we did it. It really closed off a problem permanently. There were raccoons living down there. I mean, the structure from the second floor was sitting on top of the laundry tubs in the basement in this area. So it really wasn't, we didn't have a lot of choice in what we did, and I hope they don't mind. This is the butler's pantry. It had just been whitewashed. I mean, that Victorian era, they were afraid of light. You know, the parasols and the big hats and stuff like that. They did not like sunlight. There's interesting, even agrarian articles about how they were putting blue glass in their greenhouses, thinking they could grow plants better and cure sick animals by cutting out the direct sunlight. But obviously when Mrs. Anson got back from Europe, she wanted to lighten things up a bit. This was cherry and white enamel paint originally, and this is what the students did. This was all student work fixed up. This was the kitchen pantry room for it's the butler's pantry between the servant's wing and the dining room, but we turned it into the kitchen pantry for the students' dorm. This is the way we lived in it for a few winters. We took the marble that was on the walls of the kitchen and cut it and infilled the fireplaces so we wouldn't do any damage. But we knew the fireplaces weren't going to keep us warm, and there was no heating system in there, so we put wood stoves in the rooms that we worked at. We moved into the building by this time and set up little offices. This is the first Allied Whale office in the turrets, and this is that room that's on the second floor. You go upstairs and go to the right. What is it used for?
Development.
It's development office now, but this was before the development office was there. It was somebody had painted a painting on there, I think. I don't remember, but anyway, there's an interesting story about this. So we're in the building, and we got these contractors coming and going, and Glenn Weber's sitting there smoking his pipe and reading poetry. I mean, he was the stonemason that was fixing the stone. And there was one guy who worked for Tubby Collier, an old, wonderful old guy. I think his name was Richardson. He was fixing the floor, but he knew how to be a ventriloquist. So when people would walk by, this guy would be fixing the floor somewhere, and it sounded like Mickey Mouse was talking to you in the corner. But the story of this is, we were doing all this stuff, and Ed Kelber was also smoking his pipe, and he was wonderful, wonderful person, but he didn't really care about bricks and mortar that much, I don't think. And he knew that there were people like Millard and Jonathan and Sassanine and Harris around, so we could take care of it for him. Well, we told him we were only fixing up 2 floors of the building, but really we were fixing up 3. And he'd wander through the building and never knew which floor he was on, so he had no idea what we were doing. But the wood stoves kept us warm through the winter. So Ben Baxter, I don't know, is Ben Baxter here? He was a guy working for Allied Whale. He was a COA student at the time, and he came in on a Monday morning, and he puts his hand into the wood stove to see, if the ashes are, nobody was there, if the ashes were, cold. No, they're not. They're not. They're cold. He shovels it into a paper bag and sticks it in a room full of maps. And the room, he smells smoke. He sits down, he's got the fire going, and he smells smoke, opens the door to the room, and the fire blows him across the room, knocks him down. The Bar Harbor Fire Department shows up. The windows were all smashed out. The hydrant in the street froze up. Remember that. The windows around this room got smashed out. The guys were really careful about what they did, and Ben comes in later on that afternoon, trembling like a leaf. I don't know, I'm so sorry. And I thought, God, it was a mistake. It was, I'll tell you what. You just made a mistake. It's over. It's fine. And thank goodness to Bruce Price, there was brick knocking between all the wood. That fire could only burn what little bit of wood surface was exposed to it and the paper that was in it. So I said, Ben, why don't you just, I'll tell you what, go down and sweep the broken glass up off the terrace that, was outside that window. And he goes down there and he's so wired and anxious from what had happened. And he looks out to Frenchman's Bay, and this is like January or February, and in those times, Frenchman's Bay was frozen out a bit. There's a little boy running around out there. And Ben, just nervous enough, says, what the hell's that kid doing out there? And he starts going after him because there was nobody else in that location. And probably if I were down there, I'd think, oh, isn't that cool? There's a kid out there. But he was so anxious, well, it turned out the kid had fallen through the ice, was hypothermic and delirious, and was running out to open water. So he goes out, gets the kid, brings him to Seed Fox, calls an ambulance, wraps him up, and saves his life. All on the same day. Fire and ice. Fire and ice, man, that was a day. So those were some of the stories of the turrets. Now here it is today. And it looks pretty good, actually. People have been taking pretty good care of this place, but it's old and it's hard to take care of. It's 117 years old. And really, it's had not the maintenance that it would like to have had, but enough maintenance to keep it healthy and sound. And some things have happened to it that are absolutely marvelous. I think this student project is just beautiful. It's a real place. The landscape architect that wrote about what they'd done in a very effusive way, so effusive it was hard to finish the article. But was talking about how these rusticator houses really don't have just rooms inside, there's rooms outside. And people want to be outside in these places, and they had created all this stuff. Well, this COA student surely made that a fact. Beautiful, beautiful garden. And here is what happens to stone. There's architecture isn't just about history and style and form and shape, and it's about structure too. And what happens with stone is when that ice gets in it, when ice gets in an arch like this and deteriorates the mortar between it, the stones just come closer together. When ice gets in stone put like this, and it expands when it freezes. I mean, when water gets into the cracks of the mortar and freeze, they push it apart. So there is deterioration in any of these forms that water gets into. And the other thing is the oblate missionaries, with all good intention, had plugged up the very holes that were trying to get the water out of the building so that it didn't stay there and expand and contract. But a pretty nice job has been done to keep it going for as long as we have. I'll remember one other anecdotal story. I remember we were walking people around one day and they were saying, and this was after the various contractors that all worked on the building and stuff, and we'd gotten it to a certain point, and I said, oh boy, they don't build them like they used to, do they? And we said, well, no, actually what you're looking at was completely rebuilt by Bob Norwood. This wall got all taken apart and put back together again. So it's kind of interesting that the skills of the artisans are still there, and the building is a testament, in my opinion, to the just finest skills of life's work of builders and craftspeople. What's going to kill it is the deterioration of all the buildings around here in this coast because of the freezing and thawing, which I've mentioned too many times, but also the salt air. the flashing that's around chimneys. Usually, all these old buildings, when you look at them to see how they're going to do, the first place I want to go is up to the roof and look where the chimneys come through, because the electrolytic action of salt water and air and the various metals, and sometimes people used iron nails on copper trim, or sometimes the copper trim was sitting below cedar shingles and the acid from the cedar will start to etch it out. In the case of the turrets, what's deteriorating, I would imagine, and Millard, you can tell me more, is all this stuff up in here, which is virtually impossible to get to with traditional tradespeople. I mean, you would be risking a person's life who went up there, if where the professionals can get up there and the staging can get them there and they can begin to repair this stuff. We did repair the slate roof. Part of the money that we raised didn't go to replacing it, but we actually repaired a big chunk of the slate. What they do sometimes, if they can and they find the slates, is they sort of take them apart and put pieces back together, but also they make copper tabs. They put a little hook on them, and where the slate shingle had come out, they slip it up and hook it over the nail that was up above it. And you might be able to see that if you look at the roof in some places, you see these little pieces of copper. Things like gutters and downspouts and scuppers, and this part up here, which is really, if we looked at, I'll show you something interesting that I noticed as I was leafing through these. I'm going to do this. Close your eyes, don't look. This is going to make you crazy. 1 second. Okay. See that? See how all this was pretty solid? But you see how that snow sits up in there? And how hard it would be? Who in this room wants to climb up there and, get at that? It's pretty hard. And so right now, okay, close your eyes again. This is why PowerPoint is. Right now, it seems to me that this is the first, if you were going to break it into pieces, this would be the first piece to fix. Up in here, even if these chimneys aren't used, I don't know, try to take them apart and fix them, put them back. Flashing, you could take the slates from one side of the roof and use them on another. Copper could be used in place of things. But if you look at if you look at this, these are trapezoidal cut pieces of slate, and that slate went up there 50 years ago. So it's got some life still in it, and I think probably it's my opinion that to go through phase 4 or 5 of keeping this building alive, you could do the math. You could take the building, and it cost $100,000 to build the turrets in 1895, and what's been put into it over the years, and what will cost to fix it with a whole bunch of. I believe that it's my opinion that these various tasks can be picked out and be given prices and be contracted on their own as pieces, and that things like the copper work done by Mr. Layton from Bar Harbor, and the slate work, there's some really excellent slate contractors out of Bangor, and there's some in New Hampshire too, and they tend, in my opinion, to be oddly less costly than people that aren't used to doing it, because they aren't intimidated by it and they have the equipment to do it. So I think one would hopefully have a second wave of effort to begin to save this wonderful old landmark around which so much of the college's history has grown. I've probably run out of time, but if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah?
On the patio, it faces the water, and there's 2 sets of columns. One looks sort of fluted, the other is very smooth and polished. What's the story behind those?
I don't know, I think they were imported, and I think they were part of the original building, because if we, again, if you don't mind me doing this, I'll flip back to that little picture of it before the addition was done on it. It's kind of fun to look at all this stuff too, isn't it? Let's get back to Brad's picture right there. See, they're there. There's two of them right there, still. I think they were like the Venetian railing pieces and the Indian elephant that was out front. I think they were something that was imported from Europe and put there specifically to bracket that view through the plate glass window. I don't think, unless someone knows otherwise, you see, these are stone columns that were like Turtle Point, kind of. It was a typical thing that Bruce Price did on some of those stone buildings, but those are right from the beginning, and they're interesting marble too. They're not. I don't know what kind of marble that is. Yeah.
Roc, do you have any insight into why there seems to be very little support for historic preservation since, I can't even remember the last time that Maine has approved a bond issue before we've seen the Maine Historic Preservation Commission go from 14 employees to 3 or 4.
I don't know why they do that.
It can't just be a sign of the economy.
I think, they seem to cut the budgets of people that can't defend themselves. And I think historic preservation in Bar Harbor. I think the Design Review Board, which people have differing opinions on, but it's such a sincere effort. I mean, it can be this weird nutcase thing if you go to an extreme, but in Bar Harbor it's not. And the Maine Historic Preservation is wonderful. What they did to Winslow Homer's studio, and the effort. But basically, you turn to them for guidance, and they really just can't. They don't have the staff to help you. I mean, they'll tell you everything they know. Earl Shuttlesworth will come here and give a great talk, do anything they can to help, fill out forms, encourage it, write letters of recommendation, but they don't have any funds. And it was unusual back in the 70s, early 80s, for us to get money to do plans, to pay architects to do plans. They don't even do that now. The other thing is, it's, in my opinion, it's a little bit of an exclusive club. I don't know how else to put it. Because they treasure these things and they don't want them to be messed with, like we did between the servants' wing and they want to come up with a better idea than that. And I think they have to open their doors a little wider and include more people and be more encouraging to let more people know about how they could do things. They're welcoming and give advice, but I think it would be good if they let more builders and architects, kind of help them more. Yeah.
Thanks.
How did you raise money the first time for the renovations? What process?
It was a whole bunch of stuff. That was a story that I didn't tell. One thing we did was Dick Reinhardt. We got government grants. Dick Reinhardt was an ex-Air Force guy who then worked for the government in some department, and then came to COA because his wife was Ellie Coombs from Northeast Harbor, grew up in Northeast Harbor, and they wanted to kind of retire up here, and he helped us go to the halls of Washington and knock on doors. It was so interesting to see him hobbling along on his crutches, and all these bomb salesmen down in Washington too, and Dick was knocking on the same doors trying to get some money for the turrets. And he got a small amount. He got the CETA grant, which was, they paid employees to be laborers on it. We had student work study money or something to help those kids through the summer help us. And the historic preservation people gave us a little money, and then we just really asked a lot of people to help us. It was interesting, if you ask them before you start the work, no, yeah, right, that's a good idea, yep. But if you actually are working, they get more interested in helping you. And it was sad, the Emery family of Cincinnati, Mrs. McKay, they did not want to, I mean, we really went to Cincinnati and we, did everything we could, and it was just clearly, we've made a decision, we don't want to have anything to do with it. But John Emery, who lived here in Bar Harbor and raised his family, John J. Emery was a grandson, was a wonderful guy who, he was ill when he was young, and the family kind of put him behind the curtain or something. I don't know what the deal was, but he was very bright, and he saw everything that went on, and he loved his grandparents and his uncles and his aunts, and loved the thing. And he came through with his wife and saw what we were doing, and they gave us a serious chunk of money that helped us over the top. But it was probably 12 little pools of money helping us do little tasks, not one big one. I don't know, well, I haven't been around in a long time, but I don't know how things go anymore. I don't know if I'm not a development person. I don't know if you raise large chunks of money and do large projects like the new dorms. I mean, that's pretty impressive. Or with a project like this, that you kind of drum up business and interest by just working at it a little bit at a time. That was $300,000. That is the total amount of money that we spent on that project. It was 1978, 1979, so I don't know what that means today. But that was all we had. So my feeling is that probably, it'd be interesting to see what $300,000 would do now.
Didn't we have farmer's home money for this, the dorms? Isn't that what we
That's
had?
right. Farmers' home money paid for the dorms, because that was housing, farmers' home housing. I'm trying to think of what else. There's an organization you can go to, University of Southern Maine, you can call, and they give you all of the granting organizations that are in America that are relevant to what you're trying to do. So if you were to say, well, we want to fix create a student center, or we want to fix an historic building, they will tell you, historic buildings in Maine, there's organizations that do that. Yeah.
Just a quarry question. You refer to it as the Eagle Lake quarry.
Yeah.
I'm unaware of a quarry that would have the scope to build this house around Eagle Lake, but I am aware of one that is on the west side of Duck Brook Road, on the other side of Duck Brook. And the picture you showed looks like that quarry is, do you happen to know where the quarry was? And I know it's always referred to as the Eagle Lake quarry, but I've never found one. It's around the corner of Eagle Lake.
I'll tell you what I do know. It's not going to be a good answer, but I'll tell you what I know. First of all, the guy who would know is Steve Haynes, over in Mount Desert in Soamesville. He knows about stone like nobody I've ever met in my life, and he sent me that picture. He said it's the Weber Quarry on Eagle Lake. The only thing I can think it could be is where the park has their stores their gravel and stone back there. Yeah, the Liscombe Pit Road down in there.
I don't think so, but your picture here that you had, one picture,
Yeah,
some of the equipment in it,
yeah,
looks like you're looking south, standing in that quarry. And
Okay.
that quarry is fairly large, it's in the park, it's on the west side of, right there, of Duck Brook, between Duck Brook and the carriage road, heading just north of the Duck Brook Bridge.
it could be. That could be what it is.
Ask
I do know it
Glenn
was the Weber
Weber's wife.
Quarry, is what they
Same
call it.
Weber, is Glenn Weber, Rod?
Do you know her?
Is that same as Glenn Weber?
I wondered that. His father
is
was a
Glenn
mason
Weber's.
too. Yeah, I bet it was. He was cool. He worked on it. He was a good guy.
His wife is still living, she,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Roc,
Yeah.
are there any organizations that are trying to preserve buildings that this Bruce Price built? I mean, Tuxedo Park, I imagine he built a lot of the house, or designed a lot of the houses there. If there could be interest in restoration under his sort of
We're using
umbrella.
under his umbrella. I
Well, I
don't.
mean, with the Fulton Act being
I don't know, I mean, I think there'd be a lot of things, one could call a Frontenac and talk to them. I think in the restoration world, I think everybody's struggling to figure out some way to survive. I don't think anybody who's trying to save these beautiful old buildings is having an easy go of it. And I don't know why, I mean, here's College of the Atlantic. It was wonderful when I came here because the college had had a wonderful architect design them an incredible modern campus on top of Strawberry Hill. And the students decided, why would we do that? We have these old buildings, let's stay here and rejuvenate them. Let's bring them back to life. Let's not throw more stuff away. And thank goodness they thought that. I think it's I don't know, I don't want to sound like a salesman, but I think it's a really cool thing. You have all these solar buildings and all this brilliant kind of environmental campus and school, and in the middle of it you've got this old stone pile that people are keeping alive. I think that's perfect.
Well, I in the summertime, work as a guide when the cruise ships come in, and one of the places that we bring people occasionally is to the Torrens.
Sure.
And the amount of fascination, I mean, I can barely get them out of the house, they wanna go down to the gardens, they want, you
Yeah,
know, so there
Donation
certainly is,
box?
what?
Donation box, maybe?
Well, you know, it's a start.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we're in a unique part of the world that way, I think. I mean, I don't know of too many places like this where you have these amazing historic gardens and you have these gorgeous buildings. That building that, I forget the name, it's right next to Ringing Point, David Rockefeller's house.
McCormick.
McCormick building,
Yeah.
Mrs. McCormick just gave it to the University of Illinois or something like that. And that's a gorgeous building, sort of like this. But where do you get the interest? I don't know. I think it's personal and I think it's institutional help, and I think you just put a package together. And,
Need a Facebook page.
yeah,
Seriously.
that would be good. That would be
Social
perfect.
media.
Yeah. I think that's a very good idea. There's a lot of things. And the other thing is, I don't know how many trustees are here. I don't know how many administrators from the college are here. I don't know how many people from the building committees are here. I don't know how many professors are here. But whoever is here, that's all that was there when we started the last phase. We, you know, you can do it. It's just complicated and putting one foot in front of the other. Any other? Yes.
We're English, we're visiting. I wondered whether there was any kind of organisation, like we have the National Trust and English Heritage, organisations that literally millions of people belong to, whether you have any kind of national organisation like that to help support. Buildings that belong to the National Trust have to be open to the public to a certain extent.
Well-
They are supported, a lot of old buildings are supported by the National Trust.
Well, Barb Sassman put the turrets on the National Trust for Historic Preservation in America, the American National Trust for Historic Preservation. But that was Millard's question. It was, you know, they don't help you with funds.
No.
They help you defend it from being torn down, taken over by a developer, and torn apart. But they don't really come up with funds.
So are buildings listed?
Yes.
Yeah, they are.
Yes,
So
they're
you can
registered.
have a listing which will say, right, you cannot tear this building down.
Yeah, and you see a lot of buildings in, not a lot, but a number of buildings along West Street will have a plaque on the door. They're all registered.
But is there any funding to help with that then? If they say this building is listed, you can't tear it down.
You have to raise it privately.
Carl Finch Phillip.
If we could allow Prince Philip and have
I'd suggest
Prince Charles.
maybe you writing up maybe a couple pages and distributing those to tourists that come on cruise ships.
Yeah,
Telling them where they can send money to help with the restoration.
sure.
I mean,
You don't
put up
know-
all the time.
You don't know who's gonna walk through
That's
someday.
right.
That's true. That's absolutely true.
But
Any other?
if you can't just, if the building must be preserved, In other words, if you decided to bring a bulldozer in and knock down the turrets, you couldn't.
You'd have to get some legal permission to do it,
Yeah,
but you probably could. You just have to go through the legal channels. I mean, if someone had the interest and the money, they probably could do it, but they'd have to spend a lot of legal time doing that. I think when someone's gonna tear down an historic building, a citizen has a right to stand up in defense of it, and they then have to take that person through all of the channels to get permission to do that. You can't just go knock it down.
well, that's what I meant, there is a form of protection, but then the next step would be if the building is protected, there's no, magic grab bag that you can reach into to help protect it.
No, there
Which
isn't.
they have-
Yes,
I know a lot of buildings in other parts of the, in Maine as well, but in other parts of the country that are successfully preserved, have been restored and then successfully preserved, are, as the lady from England mentioned, are open to the public in some fashion, and that helps to support their continued preservation and existence. Is it possible, or has it been explored, or is there any possible way that some or all of this structure might be open to the public during the summer season at an admission? An admission fee, or you could have docents that are knowledgeable people that glean from you and others the history of the building, and perhaps have it open 3 days a week, or have it open, I realize you couldn't do it during the cruise ship season necessarily because it's back in business as a school, but there's certainly a period of time when it might be possible to draw some of its current purposes to other places and allow at least some portions of it to be open, charge a fee. There's certainly a lot of people who come here partly because of their interest and excitement about the
summer
summer homes, the
yeah.
rusticators, et cetera.
Well, I think that's a really good idea, and what it kind of made me think of was, this would be a cool class for COA to put together, how to preserve a building, what are your options, financial, technical, so, some students are gonna gravitate to the architectural details, other ones are gonna history of the place, other people, how do we raise money, other people, what's the technical repair options we have? It'd be a wonderful way for the college to both educate people to go on into a career that's needed, and also help a building.
You might be able to provide summer work for students working as docents.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. That's a good idea. Yes.
Just for those people in the room who aren't familiar with it, Millard has been working on a plan that the trustees have approved, and it's going to cost $4 million to fix the roof and the outside without any interior work. That's the current estimate. So every fundraising effort that we can find will help diminish that, but it's a big ticket.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And I don't know.
And we have plans to start in April.
That's wonderful. And you have to start from the top down. So maybe the first $2 million gets spent, from there up. And then, next April you do spend the next, I really think that there ought to be 3 prices for every one of those tasks, and there ought to be subtasks, and I think historic buildings are interesting this way. If it was a set of plans of a building from scratch, or if it was a set of plans of, a real gut out this warehouse and turn it into housing kind of thing, that's different. But with a building that has all of this unbelievable craftsmanship in it, you can say, would you please do this part? Would you please do that? Would you give us a price for this? Would you give us a price for that? You have to do the whole roof. You have to do all the flashing. You have to repair the chimneys while you're up there. But still, you could get prices from different masons for repairing the chimneys, different roofers for doing the roof. And I think you might find that I know that you will find that the more knowledgeable, experienced tradespeople will be the lowest bidders, because they know how to do it. And I think $4 million is the right thing to say to yourself now, but as soon as people are really ready to go, as soon as some national trust gives a little money to take the plans a step further or go out to bid for a portion of it, I think you'll find that you'll have good news once you get started. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.